Welcome to Chok Muay Chats, episode 24. I'm Joe Comerford, commentator, content creator, former fighter, and general Muay Thai nerd. If you like this episode, please subscribe, share amongst your friends, and of course, like it. I'm sitting here with Dr. Sean Aspinall, my guest for this evening, a combat nutritionist for the stars of many of the world's best fighting organizations like the UFC, RWS, and of course, one championship. So we're here to talk about a little bit about nutrition, combat nutrition, and mainly about aggressive weight cuts. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
No problem. I know it sounds all very official now that I've turned the camera on.
Yeah.
Really, I'll relax a little bit. So, as I said, we'll talk a little bit about aggressive weight cuts, which tends to be a pretty big tradition amongst Muay Thai fighters in the West, especially. And it's actually, in my opinion, quite a dangerous tradition or habit to fall into, depending on your body type and that sort of thing. But when I talk about aggressive weight cuts, I'll use myself as an example from my career. So I used to fight at around 58.
Okay.
And I would walk around normally around 70.
Yep.
So that's about 12 kilos. And that's a lot of weight.
Yeah.
Now, what I would do is I would cut out carbs about 2 weeks before the fight.
Okay.
If I knew I had one scheduled in, and then I would water load and try and cut about 6 to 8 kilos a couple of days before, which I would consider a very aggressive weight cut.
Yep.
And probably not the healthiest way to do it. So doing something like that, which is not uncommon for a lot of Muay Thai fighters in the West, what are some of the long-term effects to fighters if they're doing these aggressive weight cuts like this?
I think just before we get into it, I'd be curious to know, when you were doing your weight cuts, where you said 2 weeks low carbs, had you prefaced that with dieting beforehand, or were you leaving most of your stuff to the back end of a
leaving
prep?
No, I yeah.
That sounds like the Thai way.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's probably the first thing that I pick up on is how we periodize and plan these prospective like aggressive weight cuts as such will dictate the aggressiveness of them, if that makes sense. So you'll see a lot of guys, especially in these bigger organizations, one championship, RWS, especially with the day before weigh-ins, and the UFC, where it's not uncommon for people to be cutting 15, 17, sometimes 20% worth of body weight, which when you write that up is very similar to what you were doing. Now, how you go about that will dictate the severity of it and the symptoms that come with it. I mean, if we take yours as an example in isolation, I think we present ourselves with a lot of opportunity for larger side effects by doing things in such a short period of time, which if you're fighting regularly, I understand can come with the territory of fighting regularly, but to do such an amount so regularly does bring about side effects. So if we were to break it down, let's break it down to the dehydration just to start, for example.
Yep.
Now for me, most of my practice is to put you as a fighter in a position where when we do dehydrate, because I think regardless of organization, there's dehydration happening across the board, whether it's MMA, whether it's Muay Thai, whatever organization it is, fighters are dehydrating themselves. And I know people online like to make the statement of, well, why don't you just fight at your walking weight? And my argument for the most part with that is that you can tell somebody who's never fought if they're asking that. But I think we have to say that whilst dehydration can be a very dangerous thing, it is a very widely done thing. So to make sure that, again, like I said, my job is to make sure that you're in a position to do this as safely and sensibly as possible. Now, me as a practitioner, I'm looking at things and going, what are we considering aggressive and extreme? Where are we going to get these health implications? And don't get me wrong, the dehydration is the most dangerous part. If we're dehydrating people to an excessive amount, people have died from doing that. So understanding where the guidelines are or where the boundaries are, I think, is the most sensible thing to do. So I think to start with, if you're a fighter listening to this or you've had experience of it in the past, if you're pushing levels of 7, 8, 9, 10% dehydration, which, well, for example, for you, that would have been what, if you're starting at, well, that would have been 6 kilos in dehydration, which you just told me you're doing more. So we're touching the excessive levels of which, in those scenarios, we're very, very prone to more side effects. So the way that dehydration works is the body's made up of a lot of water, and where that water comes from dictates what's going to happen. So a lot of the fighters who are dehydrating 1, 2, 3%, maybe 5%, which isn't a lot, you're going to lose a lot of that from blood plasma. You're going to lose it a lot from what we call extracellular fluid, which is the fluid outside of the cells in your body, which can be replaced very quickly. Granted, you're not necessarily ever going to feel great from doing it. But it is a territory where we can be comfortable and confident in the knowledge that if you rehydrate properly, we should be okay. Once we start to push the boundaries on the larger weight cuts, the 8%, 9, 10% body weight, if not even more, like you're saying, in a short period of time, we start to affect the water inside the cells. And once we start to affect the water inside the cells, that's where things can start to get more dangerous. We start to pull fluid from the lining of the brain. And one thing we know about this is, whilst people will do these big weight cuts, they will rehydrate, whether that is with rehydration solution or whether it's with an IV. Once we start to touch into the more aggressive dehydration methods, we know you can't replace that in the specific time needed. So we know for the lower dehydration methods or the lower levels of dehydration, we can get you hydrated and we can get you safely in the ring to a position where you're fighting as close to 100% as you can be. Once you touch these larger ones, even though you may present as hydrated, so you may pee clear, your body weight may be back to a substantial level that you're happy with. All the stuff that fighters generally would consider back to normal, once you start pulling from inside the cell, we know that can take days to replenish. So whilst you present as hydrated, you're still not going into the fight in a particularly safe space. And that brings around with a lot of complications. Like I said before, once you start pulling fluid from the brain and you start to take contact, the brain's going to move considerably more. My analogy for this is always the same: is if you put a rock in glass, if you put a rock in a glass and you fill it with water and you shake it, it'll still touch the sides, but it's going to do so at a much slower pace than if you empty that water and all of a sudden you're shattering the glass. And you can use that analogy the same for that level of dehydration. Is, are you happy in the knowledge that you're going into a fight? And we're talking like, I mean, I've just been to one championship tonight, and taking the impact of those smaller gloves, even if you're looking at MMA as well, you're taking the impact of the smaller gloves, which is a big risk anyway. Now you're taking that bigger risk with a dehydrated brain. It's just rattling around in there. And not only are you more at risk of concussion, you're also at longer lasting risks of that said concussion. So not only are you getting concussed, you're getting a more severe level of concussion. And I think that's quite a significant thing, especially if you're looking to fight regularly as well. But if you're also regularly doing these bigger weight cuts, whether you present as concussed, there is still damage going to be happening in there. And it's whether it catches you now or whether it catches you later. And I think the deterrent of that, well, the education has to be the deterrent of that, because a lot of people will still, it's one of those things as a fighter, if the opportunity is there, and you'll have seen this plenty of times in Thailand and everywhere else, if the opportunity is there, somebody's going to take it. And I think once they know that they can get away with, like you said, kilos and kilos and 10, 12, 13% of body weight lost in water, what's to stop them doing it again?
Yeah, I've got a real life case study for you to sort of back that one up. I remember I had a fight on very short notice. I think I had about a week, and I was probably walking around 68, and I had to get down to 58.
Yeah,
in a week. And I remember it was really hot because it was one of the hottest summers I've been through. And it got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore in the sauna. So I was just walking around in the sun in a sweatsuit. And I drove out to the weigh-in, just made weight by a smidgen, drove myself an hour back to my place and just lay on the tiles in my kitchen, refueling as best as I could.
Yeah.
Got to the fight and looked like absolute the worst I've ever looked. I fought this little Iranian guy who was throwing all these spinning thunder, rolling thunder kicks.
Yeah.
I took one of those, a heel to my head, and normally I had a pretty decent chin back then.
Yeah.
But that weight cut is what I think really sent me down in the spiral of losing my chin.
Yeah.
Because I took 3 big knocks and I really felt like I couldn't regain myself from that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one, I think it was the 4th one in the second round, took a big heel right to the jaw and just flat out.
Yeah.
And after that, I wasn't the same. And I think that's one of those big things. And I was doing these aggressive weight cuts and blowing, and I'll be honest as well, blowing out really badly after the fight. You know, going out on and eating Aldi pizzas, if anybody knows those stories, buying the cheap Aldi pizzas because that's all I could afford at the time. But these big, sort of Paddy Pimblett blowouts, and then having to cut that all again. And that unhealthy cycle, it's almost like an eating disorder in a bit of a way, you know?
I think just before we jump into that, I'd like to just caveat that as well. What the interesting thing you said was, and this is something to caveat as well, just to go back to the aggressive weight cuts, is you still made the weight. You still got down to that point. But what is very interesting is, whilst you're putting the body through massive levels of dehydration, now the body's very good to some extent at handling dehydration. What it's not very good at is handling heat exposure. And whilst you still achieve the goal of making weight and dehydrating yourself to a point where, yes, you maybe weren't 100% rehydrated, but you still got in and fought, what you won't have done, and like you said, you lied on the tiles, and that's what made me think of it, you expose yourself to so much heat, you risk things like heat stroke and heat exhaustion, which people don't think in the moment. And I would say for some parts, even for the smaller weight cuts as well, for the people who aren't used to the heat, or depending on the method in which you lose the body weight, whether it's a sauna or a bath, if you give yourself excessive heat exposure, so I'm talking in the sauna that is too hot for too long, or in the bath at an excessive temperature for too long, not only do you risk the side effects of dehydration, but you risk the side effects of heat exhaustion. And the heat exhaustion ones are the ones that kill people. And I know that's a really big thing to say on a podcast, but minimizing that heat exposure, if you are going to dehydrate or you have to for the opportunity, has to be something you take into account as well. So, for example, with a lot of my guys who do it, we will spread out the heat exposure into very small doses. We'll expose them to maybe 15 to 20 minutes of heat and then pull away, so the body continues to sweat, but not in a manner where we're putting them under excessive stress. Because if you're already putting yourself under excessive stress from dehydration, added to that with the heat exposure, we create like a cauldron of stuff that you realistically are not going to recover from. And even if you do hypothetically recover from the rehydration, you can still feel the effects of the heat exposure, the heat exhaustion on fight day, which is maybe where, like you said, you don't necessarily fully recover from both ends then. And then, like you said, it's an accident waiting to happen at that point. Or like you said, the chin's gone and maybe you don't recover from that as well. But I think what was interesting as well is when we talk about the actual dieting side of it, and there's a lot of research that's come out into this. So combat sports research is relatively new. I'd say in the last 5 years, 10 years more so, it's started to become something that we're understanding a lot of things from now.
And yeah, that's one of the interesting things. Like I often talk about, people who were fighting professionally back, like 8 years ago. We didn't really have access to that. Like
nothing.
People at the tail end of my career, people were just getting access to sports nutritionists.
Yes.
So it's only really a recent thing that
100%.
we've had access to this education.
And I mean, even if you start to look back at the research, like when I first got into this and I started trying to look into combat sports stuff around 2013, so you're talking 10 years ago, there was no research then. You were pulling bits of research from other sports and you had to really understand how to read research to find anything that maybe mirrored combat sports. Luckily now there's a lot of really good researchers from people at Liverpool, John Moores or Western Australia who are doing some really, really good stuff. And it's certainly on the up, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions and stuff that we do need to get a grip on. But interestingly, so Liverpool, John Moores did a research study maybe 5 or 6 years ago on exactly what you're saying about blowing up and whether the blow up afterwards is an eating disorder and whether it's something you can actually control. And this is something that I looked into in my PhD as well because it fascinates me. And this is from my own experience of a weight cut as well. So I came back to the ring after 10 years in October last year. And I fought at 60 kilos, but I did a U and was walking around at 74 kilos.
Wow.
So that was a 14 kilo weight cut in 8 weeks, which I know how to do it, so it was relatively comfortable and it was very safe to do. But I underestimated the binge eating side of it after the fight.
Yeah.
And it was to the point where I knew from experience with other people and experience with fighters and research that it was maybe going to come, but experiencing it yourself is something different because I'd say to people it's a different level of hunger above and beyond just being hungry. It's never satiated, it's never satisfied, it's never full, and it's always you can eat anything and will eat anything. I listened to another podcast and it was on this, and it was a nutrition researcher who said he had a boxer who rang him after the weigh-in in tears because he says, listen, I've gone to the fridge and I've eaten a Mars bar and I'd not known I'd eaten it until I've looked at the wrapper. And he said it was just an autonomous response that he was oblivious to that he was doing it. This hunger signal was so big. And I think what I don't want to tell people is, because I think there's some nice research coming out now in eating disorders and combat sports on what these excessive weight cuts do. And I think that will come out in time, a better representation of what we see in terms of eating disorders and combat sports, because it is very weight focused and it always is going to be. And there is.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those really tough things in combat sports.
It is.
You know, like the almost unhealthy obsession with making weight, and then trainers trying to get you down to weight, and then controlling your food as well. You know, it's a really tough kind of avenue or even thing to talk about for a lot of people.
I think the more people do talk about it, though, the better, because I think the sensitivity and the understanding to it from a coach's perspective or an athlete's perspective is how you get over it in terms of, because I'm seeing for people who've not been to Thailand, who haven't been to Thailand, the Thais are very forward and very unfiltered in what they say, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I think if you are to come here to cut weight, you have to be a little bit, I don't know what the word is, a little bit thick-skinned to what they say. Because
I mean, like, okay, I go to the gym and the boss will say, "Oh, Joe, very fat. You very fat." I'm like, well, you're not wrong, but you know, but it's unfiltered. And it doesn't come out. It doesn't come from a bad place.
Of course, that's what people need. Yeah, it's not from a bad place. It's just it's a communication thing, I think.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've had a lot of females, especially because, not to say that eating disorders affect males or females differently, but I think there's a larger prevalence in females.
Yeah.
And I think the research will kind of back that up, or women are more open to speaking about it. But especially coming to Thailand, I've seen some girls who'd had maybe 1 or 2 weeks off with injury, and they've come back and the Thai trainers have gone, "No, you're too fat. You know hip pads. You go run till you're skinny."
Yeah.
And then you go, "Oh, you can't say that." Like, but again, it can still go back to what I'm saying is, if we're going to manage this, and it goes back to the UK as well in terms of how we speak about it and the understanding around it. So when we demonize these people in terms of these post-fight binges, I think the first question I ask people is, can you actually do anything about it? And for me, when you actually dive into the research and the reading behind why this happens, it's not necessarily, and you might tell me the same, it's not necessarily a desire to do it. Because a lot of fighters will have this where I've seen this quite a lot in terms of they've got pictures saved of foods on Instagram and stuff, and then they get to actually after the fight and they go, I don't actually want this. So it's not necessarily the desire to eat certain foods. It's what we call, or the researchers coin it's called hyperphagia, and it's called rebound hyperphagia when it comes to athletes, in that we have depleted the body so much over such a long period of time, and in such an aggressive manner for people who are doing, let's say, excessive weight cuts. So once I see this kind of post-fight binge clear up when people are choosing weight categories that are suitable for themselves, you see less of a rebound afterwards, and it's more controllable. But for those who are or have tendencies to do bigger weight cuts, this rebound hyperphagia is, you've got to think, for the duration of a 10 or 12 week camp, which is what a lot of people in the West are going to do, or Australia, wherever, you create such a massive deficit over such a long period of time. We get like a little bit of an imbalance in the body and hunger signals and all the hormones that kind of dictate that. And once you give somebody the green light just to go back to normal, one, we have a skewed perception of what normal is. But two, to actually get back to baseline, considering, let's say you've lost 14 kilos or 12 kilos, you lose a considerable amount of lean mass along the way with that. And the body will do everything in its power to regain that lean mass. Now, for those who are listening, or Joe, I'm not sure, lean mass takes a long time to put on.
Yeah.
Lean mass, if you go to the gym, takes a long time. And the body's adaptive response to putting lean mass on is to get as much energy in as possible to level that out. Now, with doing that, so you're putting the energy in, you're putting the energy in, you're putting the energy in. Granted, the lean mass goes up very slowly, but the fat mass accumulates really, really quick.
Yeah.
And we get something called fat overshooting, which is we fill the body with so much energy, the lean mass levels out as to where it was before the fight, but we've had to consume so many calories to do so, we have this massive excess of fat.
I suppose that's why you see a lot of fighters, like, they'll come into the weigh-in looking shredded, but then when they come in, they've got sort of like, chunky hips and the fat spilling over the shorts a little bit. Yeah.
And it's when you look at people like, again, Paddy Pimblett's a good example, or even the likes of Ricky Hatton, the effect that has longer term as well. You're talking this fat overshooting happening over a period of time. And the research study that was done showed like a span of like, I think it was something like 10 fights. And over the span of 5 years, a fighter had come in to fight camp with less muscle mass and more body fat every single time they'd fought. So not only are you aging and performance declines, but you're also putting yourself in a position where physically you just aren't the same athlete every time you step in the ring. You may be more skilled, but if you're stepping in with less muscle mass and more body fat to the beginning of every single camp, you're not gaining any muscle mass in that camp. You're only risking more muscle mass loss. And that less muscle mass puts you at bigger risk of that fat overshooting every single time. And this guy was a very, very good boxer. Don't get me wrong. And he had a very, very good career. But it's one of those things that catches up with you eventually.
Yeah.
And if you're coming into camp fatter with less muscle mass and you're still doing a massive dehydration at the end, in my opinion, I don't, and the researcher's opinion, that's definitely not the way to do it, but that's the way that people will still do it.
Yeah, it's 100%. You look at, just thinking about it as you say that, I'm just thinking about photos of my first fight and then my very last fight.
Yes.
Coming to my first fight, ripped, looking like an action hero. Then my last one, skinny fat.
Yeah.
Crazy.
My favourite example of this, and I don't know if you'll see this, and if he does, it's not a shot. One of my favourite fighters back from the UFC days was Darren Till. And Darren Till was an absolute specimen of a fighter. And you look at his early days when he was fighting Tyron Woodley and when he was fighting all these, he was absolutely starching everybody. And he was a beast of a man. But he was notorious for, he was fighting at 77 kilos maybe. And I know he used to walk around 100 kilos plus.
Wow.
So his weight cuts were horrendous. And his dehydration methods were horrendous as well. And his stubbornness to do this properly, I think, is what was his down doing. And I think the more you look at his fights and you see the shape he comes in as these fights progress, he comes in worse shape time and time again and still uses the same methods. And I think the younger fighters can get away with it, and the younger fighters will get away with it to a point. And I think that is what we need to instill in these younger fighters, whether it's Thailand, whether it's the West, whether it's Australia, wherever it is if you can do it right from the off, the longevity in your career is going to be so much better. Whereas you can get away with these massive weight cuts, but there comes a point, and I've had to have hard chats with people back home as well, in that we can't make this weight category anymore. Or if you do, I can't take you through this because I can't continue to put you through what we're putting you through to get there. And what I don't want to, and this is something that the UK has a lot of, and I think it's a really horrible trait, is people use these big weight cuts as a badge of honor, and we use it as
they do it in Australia as well. Yeah, it's a big thing in Western Muay Thai and Western combat sports, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not sure why it's a thing. But it is a thing. It's, I've cut this much and I've rehydrated this much and now I'm so much heavier on fighting. And I'm like, that's not the point of this.
Yeah.
Like, the point is to get you in there in the healthy, in the primest condition possible. And you can't tell me that you've just done a 10-week camp on near to no food. And yeah, you're looking like you're shredded for sure, but you're probably stepping into that ring in the poorest condition of health you've been in all camp. And I'm like, there's no circumstance in which that should be presented for a fighter. And that's where we circle back to, how are you progressing and periodizing this weight cut to make sure that, one, it's appropriate, two, you're going to do an appropriate level of dehydration, but you're not putting yourself in a position to have all these side effects, whether it's in the fight or for those post-fight rebounds and things like that. Because with the more aggressive strategies, you get the more aggressive side effects. You get the higher risk of eating disorders. You get the like I said, the higher risk of being knocked out, the higher risk of thinking. I think if you wrote that on paper to somebody when they started the fight crew and gone, this is what it's going to be like to fight, you go,
it's probably not worth it.
Yeah, I'm all right. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I think it also comes down to having conversations like this and changing the attitude around weight cuts and more education. There's a couple of you guys who do seminars around different gyms, and I've seen it a lot more online. And this is what gyms need to do, in my opinion.
I agree.
Is get combat sports nutritionists in, and you need to educate athletes about the potential risks and the culture of weight cutting. We need to shift it and turn it on its head and turn it around to doing the safe methods and giving people access to the education.
And you know what I found? I found that once a gym or an individual within the gym adopts it and does it properly, and people within that gym see the positive effect that has on not only the weight cut, but the enjoyment somebody has throughout a fight camp. Do you know what I mean? Like, you get into the sport because you love it. And I've seen a lot of people and a lot of very talented people leave this sport, not because they hate the sport, but because they hate the weight cut.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's a wild notion, because you still love the sport, you still want to do it, but you're in no competitive state to fight at that body weight because of the position you've put yourself in. And that's a really sad thing. But what I was saying was, I've noticed that once you can change the culture within one person, within two people within a gym, it filters through the whole gym. And I think if we can get that enough, then that becomes the standard within said country, for example. I think that's going to be harder to implement in Thailand, because Thailand has their very own set ways of doing it. But even my exposure to the Thais, understanding and seeing the way the Westerners do it, they're becoming more on board with it.
Yeah.
I still think that's going to be a hard barrier to get over, but especially in Australia and the States and the UK, a lot of people are starting to take note, and it'll take its time, but it's changing. And I think it's changing for the better. But you're right. I think it's having the conversations. It's changing the culture. It's not even just with the athletes, but with the coaches. And because the coach is going to be, I'm only one man, and I'd say there's only maybe, unfortunately, there's probably only a handful of people in this industry that I would trust to. If somebody didn't come to me, I would send them to maybe only 2-3 other people.
Yeah.
Which maybe isn't enough people, but if you can choose one of those people and do it correctly, and I mean, the more successful people these days are choosing the people who've got nutritionists, and I think that's an important thing to see.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, while we're talking about it, the weight cuts and the relationship with food, I think a big part of the education is the type of foods that you're eating as well, because, the old the old sort of notion of like the only way you're going to get the weight down is just by eating broccoli and and steamed fish. You know, like I have a look at the stuff that, you know, guys like Shabby and Alfie are eating. There's plenty of colors in there. Yep. There's plenty of different lean proteins. And that's a big part of it as well. You 100%. Don't have to eat boring and sludge. You can actually eat good food.
Yeah, and I think this is one thing as well that we forget is that fighters are fighters, but they're also people as well.
Yeah.
And you take people out of a fight camp and people still want to have these things that aren't necessarily classed as good. And I think I'm hoping that we're moving away from the days of just clean eating. And people misconstrue this online. And I get a lot of stick for this online because I'm quite passionate about it. But I think any diet should be made up of, like we said, the lean proteins, the colourful stuff, the whole foods for the most part. But take Alfie, for example. And especially when you're stressing and it's coming to a weight cut and it's a big fight, you need something mentally to be able to switch off and still to enjoy. And when it comes to fight week, sometimes there's not a lot to enjoy. And I think the one thing that we did with Alfie last time was that we included little sweet bits and things like ice cream before he went to bed. And I'm like, if you can put yourself in a position to facilitate somebody just having an ice cream, which boosts morale, which puts them in a much better mind space throughout the whole of fight week, and they still make weight in a very, very easy manner, why would you not do it? And these foods like ice creams, and there's a lot of demonization of these processed foods online. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these are in the diet all the time. I'm saying if you're an athlete, it's fueled on whole foods and quality foods to get quality training. But if having a small packet of something you enjoy or a small ice cream or something fits within the confines of what you're doing and you can get away with it and you enjoy it, then the morale and the relationship with food is way more positive. We see less demonization around food groups, and foods are labeled less as good and bad, and people have a much easier time reaching for things that they maybe necessarily wouldn't, because they have the understanding as to, okay, I'm doing this, I fuel training, I'm in a position where I can do this and I will do this. But again, that goes back to, if you're doing super aggressive weight cuts, you don't put yourself into a position to do it. So do we harm relationship with food by having to be so restrictive? To some extent, yes. And if you can make sensible decisions throughout fight camp and plan it properly, there's nothing to say that you can't have these nicer foods, these more mixed foods. Like if you can have a fight camp filled with pastas and burgers and salmon and grilled foods and like breads and stuff that people would demonize, that sounds like a good fight camp to me. And like it goes back to what you're saying in terms of it's miles and miles and steps away from eating just chicken and broccoli for 6 weeks. And then that in and of itself, that restriction, that demonization, that I can't have these things, the second that fight is done, you can have those things now and you will have them all. Whereas if you have them all the way through fight camp, the novelty is not necessarily there. You'll still have them, but you'll be able to control the desires for them more. And I think exposure to those poorer quality foods I like it on a daily basis. Like for me, I'm cutting weight at the moment, but my non-negotiable for myself, I love Haribo. And mine is, as long as my day is planned and my training is fueled and I'm recovered, if I can fit Haribo at the end of the day, I'm going to do it, because mentally for me, it's so much easier to do. And I find it harder when it's not there. And some people may see that as weakness, or you don't need that, or you shouldn't be having that. And I'm like, I'm totally fine. It's going all right. Same with Alfie, same with all my other guys, is that if we can have foods you enjoy on a daily basis, the whole diet experience is more enjoyable.
I think that's a really important part of it. I don't think we need to go through this, self-infliction of pain.
No.
Like, why would you try and make yourself suffer?
Yes.
Oh, because I've got to be a hard man. No, why wouldn't you try and make your weight cut as easy as possible?
In my head, the sport is hard enough in and of itself, because the fight camp, you will suffer in fight camp. It will be hard. It will be, it's arduous. And I'm thinking, if there's things outside of training that aren't hard, that are easy, that make your life just that little bit easier, do them. Do them consistently. Do them every day. If you enjoy it, do it every day to a degree where you can get away with it. I don't see the sacrifice or the suffer. I've seen people, again, hold it as a badge of honor to, I've not done this, and I've I fought this every day, and I'm like, just don't. You'll have so much free mental space to be able to put into training and thoughts around the things that you're actually going to go and do. This is you showcasing your skill at fighting, not your resilience to diet or how hard it is to diet. Like, you get no extra points for that, and you don't win the fight on how hard your diet was.
Yeah.
Like, I would much rather see people enjoy a fight camp, and a happy fighter is a dangerous fighter.
Yeah.
And if you're happy through fight camp, like, that's the best position to be in.
And I think that's I don't want to use my skills in pun making, but I think that's a lot of food for thought right there.
Just before we go, I think what I'd quite like to give people to go away with is maybe some markers that they can take home as to where I would consider a sensible cut to be.
Yep.
So that they can kind of look at this afterwards and go, okay, my weight's here, we're sensible. I think the first thing for doing a sensible weight cut is get a body composition assessment. If you can get one, whether it's electrical impedance or whether it's a DEXA scan or whether it's a skin fold, get something, because we can then show you your appropriate weight category. I can tell you off the numbers, you need to make this weight, and you can make it, and you can make it comfortably. But as a rough guide for most people, I think if you can be 15 to 17% away from fight weight at any one time, that's not too bad. I think you've got to give yourself long enough, obviously, to be able to diet backwards, but 15 to 17% is okay. My targets for a lot of my fighters is I like to get fighters into fight week about 7% away from fight weight. Now, that's dependent on a lot of things, from whether they're male or female. Females a little bit less, males can do a little bit more. It also depends on tolerance. It also depends on the level that you're fighting at. So you can go up to 10%, but 7 to 10% going into fight week is a decent place to be. Obviously, then you can utilize your fight week strategies, your low fiber, your low carbs, low sodium. And then in an ideal world, you want to be dehydrating less than 5%. So if you were to do the maths on that and you're miles away from where you are, I'd probably say maybe you're in the wrong weight category. And if you're somewhere within there, but you come into fight week a little bit heavier, come in a little bit lighter and see how much easier it is. But as a quick summary, that'd be 15 to 70% at any point, 7 to 10% into fight week, and then less than 5% from dehydration. And I personally would say that's a relatively sensible weight cut as long as you give yourself enough time. And I think that could be something you could do consistently. Maybe not if you fight every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks, like in Thailand, then you're talking a little bit, you need to change things. But if you're fighting day before weigh-in in the West or Australia or wherever, that would be sensible. Sorry, last little caveat, and this is a pet peeve for everybody back in the UK. If you're fighting, and I have a lot of you guys who are listening who are my clients know this, if you're fighting N class or C class, and even to some extent B class, you should not be doing massive weight cuts. There is nothing in this enough worth risk putting your health for, especially if you aren't fighting for big money or big opportunity. Stop it, because and I'm no good example because like, I mean, my cut, I'm doing that, but for the most part, if you're fighting consistently, the goal is, especially if you're young, is to fight and gain experience and become a good fighter. And you can't do that if you're cutting excessive amounts. Like, I've seen guys in the UK doing 16, 17 kilos to fight a C-class fight. And I'm like, that is absolutely mental. Like, you have to be more appropriate. And this goes back to coaches taking the lead as well and saying, no, the appropriate weight category for your lower level fighters is imperative, because the side effects that we've talked about all the way through this podcast are not worth for, if you're fighting for nothing or you're fighting for 150 quid, like, it's just not worth it in my book. It's really, really not. Yeah,
I remember back in the day, my trainer would say, for your first fight, you're not cutting more than a kilo.
And I agree with that.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'll just say this as well. Somebody messaged me the other day on Instagram and said, "Hi, can you do diet plan for a 12-year-old cutting weight and water?" And I was like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Like,
that's madness.
This is something else for coaches as well. And I know this is going on a bit, but when we're talking about growth and development of fighters, and especially these younger fighters, we don't know the effects of these long-term diets and big weight cuts on these young kids.
Yeah.
And I know if I was a father and I had a son or a daughter who was fighting, there's no circumstances that I would be putting my kid through big weight cuts, big water cuts. You don't know the effects on growth. You don't know the effects on development. You don't know the effects on brain development, which isn't fully formed at this point anyway. So anybody who comes to me whose child is less than the age of 18 asking for big weight cuts, the answer is always going to be no. And as a parent, it should always be no as well, I think.
100%. That the kids should not be cutting weight at all.
No.
I would say even up, especially for males, up to the age of 25. I mean, we don't develop our frontal lobes till the age of 25, you know?
I did a video last time I came to Thailand on that. I think the UK and Australia should all do same day weigh-ins, because as much as Thailand isn't the shining light of an example as to how to do a weight cut, the same day weigh-ins I find deters people from going too low.
Yeah.
And I think for me, if you're doing N class, C class, B class, or whatever the equivalent would be in Australia, weigh in same day, fight the same day. You'll find people who are healthier, who are better at the sport, who fight more consistently. It brings up the level of the sport within the country. You probably have a longer retention rate of people there. And then when they get to these professional fights where there's money or there's opportunity to fly abroad and fight with elbows and fight in Thailand, come do your weight cuts then. But until then, my opinion is that everybody should be doing same day weigh-ins, minimal weight cuts.
I would 100% agree with you on that. From my experience at least, I think some of the practices in the West are very dangerous indeed.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way to deter it, because people won't be able to do these big weight cuts anymore. And the sad thing is that if they do, they're going to see bigger side effects from it. But my hope is that coaches and people around the UK would be like, maybe that's not the best idea, because we can't do this anymore because you don't have long enough to rehydrate.
Yep.
That would be. I know they do that a lot in the amateur days at the UK, and it does deter people. And I would love to see that implemented through C and B class. I think that would be the best thing to happen to UK Muay Thai.
Yeah, I think a big thing for at least for Australian amateur Muay Thai, they do that. They
do, and I think that's where I got the inspiration from, working with a few Australian fighters now, and I was like, that's the way to do it. Like, even with the Australians tend to weigh in really late in the day as well, at like 6-7 p.m. to try and deter even your A-class fighters from doing it, because the refuel time is a lot shorter.
Yeah.
And I know that doesn't necessarily work to the same degree, but I think once you're at that top level, you have to assess the risk you're taking yourself. That's on you and your coach. But I think for the amateur guys and the lower level guys, don't put yourself in that scenario if you don't have to.
No. Why would you put yourself in harm's way?
Yeah.
I mean, you're doing that as soon as you enter the ring anyway, so why make it hard for yourself? Exactly.
And people, like I said, people slander Thailand for the way that they cut weight all the time, but I love it. Like, I've just been to Hua Hin and they pull you and go, what do you weigh? And they go, okay, you fight next Friday at the same weight. And I'm like, mint. Do you know what I mean? Amazing.
I remember up north, I think they weighed us, I was versing a Thai, and they weighed us up against each other. And they wasn't even a weigh-in. It was just they felt our muscles and had a look that they were
same.
Yeah, same size, and that was about it. You know?
Yeah.
You know, and that's all. What I also loved always about fighting here was that I didn't have to do weight cuts. I didn't have to do weigh-ins, and I always liked fighting up in the sticks because of that. You could just go in. There was none of that pressure, none of the shit of going through that.
Yeah,
and I always fought my best.
Honestly, I've seen so many people fight so much better doing that. And everybody who I've spoke to in the UK, and a lot of people who are in Thailand at the moment from the UK, will agree with me on this, is that they love fighting in Thailand so much more because the pressure is less. There's less rigmarole around that weight cut. They know they're not going to have to do it. It's a case of, I get to go in there feeling great, showcase my skills to the fullest extent, and that's what it's about. And they come out most of the time amazingly healthy. They less beat up, like, you're such a low risk of everything bar obviously the injuries from the sport itself. And I don't think it's coincidence that the amount of people who come back from Thailand and go, I love that way more than I did back home, and I'm like, there's probably a reason for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of those things. You probably come back less injured as well, you know?
Yeah.
Because of all the effects of the weight cuts that they have on you.
Yeah.
You know, it's like a lot of the Thais will drink this herbal drink after a fight to get rid of the inflammation and bruising. But you know, I remember some of the aggressive weight cuts back in Australia. You just feel so sore after fights. You know, the amount of dehydration that's out of your body, no fluid inside your muscles, just cramping all the time. You know, imagine like going to sleep and you're basically eating blood. You know, it's terrible.
It happens, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's mad.
Yeah, horrible stories from back those days. But I think we'll leave that for another podcast. But my friend, thank you very much for jumping on. This was a really good chance for people to listen in and educate themselves about this sort of darker side of the sport as well.
Because I think from the spectator standpoint, they see two people going at it and they don't see this behind the scenes thing. I think us being in the sport kind of take it for granted as to that's the expectation. But from the wider audiences, I know like some of my clients who aren't even involved in combat sports go, what on earth did they do? Like, how are these guys losing so much weight? And I'm like, that's the expectation. Like, so to show it to the fighters, to the coaches, to everybody outside, and hopefully change a few people's minds on, or at least give perspective as to what needs to happen.
The whole purpose of Chok Muay Chats is to open the line of conversation about these issues. And, you know, I don't just talk to fighters. I don't just talk about fights. It's about the whole ecosystem of the industry. And this is one of those fundamental things that are so important to the sport and that needs to be talked about that often isn't talked about.
I agree. Pushed under the rug and it happens, but we won't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, my friend, where can people check out your work and where can they find you on social media?
You can find me on social media at originproject_, and you can find me on TikTok at usually red.
Okay. I will put the links in the description below. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for another episode of Chok Muay Chats. You have been listening to the wonderful Dr. Sean Aspinall, combat nutritionist extraordinaire, and also a doctor. He's a very, very smart man, so you should listen to what he has to say. Me, just a quasi Muay Thai nerd and a trick of all trades, but a master of none. If you like this episode, make sure you like, share, and subscribe amongst your friends. It'll be available on YouTube and Spotify. I am over and out.